So today what we are going to do is look at certain legal issues which are faced by startup. And when I say startups, what we've done in this presentation is that we've specifically focused on issues which are faced by startups. Quickly, a brief introduction about myself. So I am a company secretary and lawyer, and I'm the managing partner and founder at Real and Associates, and our focus remains supporting the startup ecosystem. Now, in this presentation, what we are going to be doing is we are going to be talking about part one, which is about the possible business structures that startups will have, or the business structures which startup will have to look at from getting their setup into a proper company form. Then we are going to look at certain elements from NDA and the co-founders agreement. And then we are going to look at part three. We are going to look at Startup India recognitions. Now, business structure, that's one of the most important decisions that a startup will take. And when I say business structure, this is a structure that he will have in terms of either incorporating a company. Now, whether it should be a private limited company or a limited LLP, or it should be a one-person company. These are certain decisions that a startup will have to take, because we know that this is a decision which will have a long-term impact on a startup. So when we talk about business structures, we know that this is one of the most important decisions that startups have to take. We know that to have an effective legal structure is significantly important for a startup, because there are a lot of disclosures and compliance and future prospects which are associated with the legal structure that a startup would choose to use at the beginning. Then we are going to look at the long-term impact and the future of the organization. Now, you need to understand one thing, that as a startup, when you decide the business structure, there are certain points that you need to keep in mind. One is the level of control. Two, you're going to look at the formation challenges that are going to be associated with you. Very, very important element that you also need to keep in mind is the tax implication. And then another very important point from a startup perspective is the kind of liability that is going to be associated with them. Now, these are certain very, very important points that startups will have to keep in mind when they decide to do the business structure. Here in this slide, what we are going to look at is the types. So by now you have understood the significance of business structure. You know that certain significant business decisions or the liability, the future of the startup to a very large extent depends upon the business structure that a startup chooses to pick up. So what are the different types of business structures that we have? One we have is a sole proprietor. The second business structure that a startup will have will be a company, which is either a private limited company or it could be a public limited company. The fourth structure that a startup can pick up for themselves is limited liability partnership. Point 5 is one-person company. Point 6 is Section 8 company, and point 7 is the partnership. So these are certain business structures that a startup will choose for themselves. Now, as far as private limited company is concerned, guys, remember you will have membership. There is a 2 members requirement for a startup to form a private limited company. Then the liability is limited. When I say the liability is limited, I am trying to say that the liability of the company or the members who are running that company is limited to the extent of what they have agreed at the beginning, whether it's limited by shares or limited by guarantee, or if they have intentionally decided to pick up an unlimited liability, then that's a different thing. But as a company form of a setup, you do get an advantage to limit your liability in any given point of time. Then is your perpetual succession. So members may come and go, but the company will go on forever. Directors in a private limited company, there is a minimum of 2 directors, and the name of the company will end with the word private limited. Now, very, very simple. The registration process is relatively simpler when you talk about the limited liability partnership versus the private limited company. So a few things that you need to be aware, that whenever you are incorporating a company, first thing that you will need is a DSC, which is your digital signature certificate for a proposed director. Now this is an electronic signature of the proposed director, and that is why it's called as director. That is why it's called as digital signature certificate. Now, second important thing for you to form either a private limited company or to form a limited liability partnership is that you need to obtain director identification number, which is what is called as DIN. The third thing that you have here is to obtain the name approval from MCA, and then once you have the name approved, you will go proceed with filing of other relevant documents like your memorandum of association, article of association, and do all the necessary filing with the registrar of companies. Here again, to a very large extent, your registration process for a limited liability partnership remains similar to what you have just learned about partnership, but just one thing that you need to remember, like the way a private limited company would have directors, limited liability partnership would have designated partners. That is what they are called in a limited liability partnership. Rest everything remains similar, which is what you can see from step 1, step 2, step 3 and step 4. In terms of the registration cost, incorporating of LLP is relatively less expensive in terms of getting a private limited company incorporated for yourself. Even from a compliance perspective, the compliance requirement for a LLP are relatively less as compared to that of a company form of a setup. And when I say company form of a setup, I am referring to private limited company. Now, from a fundraising perspective, it is always important and it's always good to have a private limited company vis-a-vis your limited liability partnership. Foreign investment, from a foreign investment perspective, again, your private limited company stands to be more beneficial, because for an LLP, they can only accept foreign investment with the prior approval of Reserve Bank of India, but which is not the case for a private limited company, provided that particular investment that's made comes under the automatic route. So that is what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying and giving you the difference between an LLP and a private limited company for you to evaluate which structure stands better for you. Now, agreement, there are going to be a lot of agreement that you as a startup will have in place. You're going to have pre-shareholder agreement, you're going to have founders agreement, you're going to have something called as NDA, and then startup training agreement template. Now, pre-shareholder agreement will typically be an agreement between the pre-shareholder, a kind of an understanding between the proposed shareholders, and this is going to have certain details like this agreement is very important because, you know, a lot of times startups may come in place but not really see the light of the day, and that is where the understanding between the shareholders is very, very important, because if for whatever reason, if they're not able to really bring up a structure together, a lot of time, a lot of intellectual property rights are involved, a cost is involved, and it's always better to bring down and to bring down it in a legal form, so that tomorrow if there is any kind of a conflict that comes up, you have something to rely on. Now, your pre-shareholders agreement will typically have the name, address, email, phone number. It will have the details of concept. It will have details of intellectual property right. It will have a plan to develop a concept and the agreement period for which that particular agreement has been made. Then we have something called as founders agreement. Now, founders agreement is an agreement between the founders. It's a partnership. It's a partners to the agreement. Basically, 2 people or 3 people or as many founders as would have come together to form a particular startup. So, this is an agreement between those individuals. This particular agreement will talk about the ownership of share. We'll talk about objective of entering into an agreement. We'll talk about the roles and the responsibility of the founders. We'll talk about competition restriction clause. We'll talk about exit situation. We'll talk about exit, and we'll also talk about abnormal exit situations. Then further, this agreement is going to have something called as rules governing share disposal. It'll have market value determination. It'll have certain things like disclaimers and order of interpretation, insight and confidentiality, which is one of the very, very important clause in any agreement. It'll also give reference to any shareholders agreement if there are any. Communication among partners to the agreement, what happens when there is a dispute and which is a governing law, and the term for which this agreement, the founders agreement, stands to be valid. Then there is a non-disclosure agreement. This is typically done to ensure that any part of the confidential information is not going out from that particular setup. And this is where the NDA or non-disclosure agreement will come in place. Now, startup trainee agreement template, this is typically, in terms of the content, this agreement will typically have the kind of period of training, the objectives of training, the expectation from the company. So, in case this is typically, an agreement that will come in place if there is a startup which acquires the service of a trainee who's working with them. Again, as I said, startups work in an ecosystem which is highly, bound to break. So from that perspective, if there's anything that comes up in a legal matter, it's very important that there has to be an agreement, a document to support that understanding. And this is where again a startup trainee agreement template this agreement particularly comes in place. Then this agreement should also talk about how the termination of a relationship will happen, what are the obligations of the trainee, what is the proprietary information and confidentiality, inventions and work product, and disputes and governing laws. Further, this particular also will talk about. Okay, so now we're going to look at Startup India scheme, very, very important scheme. This is a scheme which has been launched by the government of India. Now, this is basically to encourage a lot of startups to be recognized as a startup. The moment you're recognized as a startup, there are a lot of benefits that you enjoy. What I've done is I've intentionally placed a website here, and this is something that I've done because I wanted you people to kind of go through and see what it is. So this scheme, the moment you get yourself registered under the scheme, there is a lot of tax benefit and a lot of other fee benefits that you get, by the government of India. Very, very important for a startup to be registered here. This is another thing which is simplification and hand-holding is done. Fund support and incentives, which is another very important support that a startups would need. Coverage and eligibility, very, very important. For a coverage and eligibility under the scheme, there are certain requirements that you need to be mindful of. Why register your startup? Because it's easier to get funds for startup. It's easier compliance norm for startup, simpler regulation to help startup register and stay in India, easier access to infrastructure and mentorship through wider industry programs. So with that, we finished our presentation on legal issues faced by startups. These are my coordinates. You can reach out to me for any legal and secretarial support that you would need from your side. Thank you so much.